Very good. Thank you.
In
For showing.
1900, where these photographs were taken, it was only 70 years until there were footprints on the moon. How fast they go.
It's like that or fun, I think. Have they done a microphone test? I can see that it's on, but have they done a microphone test?
I don't know.
Huh?
I don't know. And the other one I was going to tell about my grandmother and the laundromat.
Oh yes, no, that's a must. That's a must. I wish I could remember what it was in the journal about the locust plague too. About looking what a silver went for, but they couldn't even get that. They know what it's worth. But definitely the laundromat.
Yeah.
Let's go. I know it's working because it's green and red. I don't know if there's a mic for the room. I don't know if there's a microphone for the room. Those on the lapel are just for my yeah.
He's behind you. And Nancy. About 3 rows back.
So you guys know these are just for my phone. They're not to do with the room, right?
Yes.
Okay.
We have to use the other
You have to use
microphone.
the other one for the room. Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure you didn't. You're like, what? Why is it working?
You ready to get started?
Ready.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out and joining us this evening. We're going to start off with our friends at the library card drawing. Kathy Bongers. So you get a plate of kolache. Coming up next Monday at 6 p.m., we're going to host a campus safety program here put on by the David City Police Department. If you know of any college students, this would be a great program for them to come out to. Our genealogy group and book club will also be meeting next Monday. Our next Food for Thought program will be on August 21st at noon. We'll have Mark Domke presenting on his travels to Salzburg. Please get yourself signed up for that program if you'd like to attend. And I'd like to thank Jackie Mashik for the kolaches tonight. This evening's program is sponsored in partnership with the Butler County Historical Society. So please welcome our speakers, Alan Covault and Jim Reisdorff.
Thank you, Lucy. Can everybody hear me, of course? And are we far enough back that you on this side can see the screen all right? Very good. Okay, well, again, good evening, everyone. I guess I'm the moderator tonight, Jim Reisdorff, and my co-presenter here, Alan Covault, both from the David City area. We do appreciate you all coming here to learn about Butler County's forgotten farm photographer. Now, I will provide a few opening remarks regarding the program. I will then let Alan tell much of the story about his family's involvement in Butler County farm history for about 150 years. Now, what prompted the creation of this program was that Alan had given a program several months ago at our Owls Club organization here in David City. There, he had handed around original copies of many of the following photographs and told members about his family's farm ties to Butler County. Well, being there, I was amazed at the professional quality of the historical images and how they illustrated what farm life was like here in the county at the start of the 20th century. What also astonished me was to learn that these images had been taken by a relative of Alan's who had been a farmer by profession, but who had also practiced a side career as a skilled professional photographer. Result was that Alan agreed to help me produce this program for a larger audience. Our goal here is to give a small degree of recognition to his relative for having been Butler County's forgotten farm photographer. And that person is Alan Pearle Hudson, born 1865, died 1959. He's otherwise known as Pearlie, I believe.
Yes.
By the family. Pearlie, who with other members of his family farmed in the Platte Valley area, otherwise known as the Valley region of the county, of course, which is about 6 miles north of David City. This opening photo, the self-portrait of Pearlie, is an example of the excellent type of farm photography work that he accomplished. As you see here, this is a pretty awesome image for depicting a horse-drawn corn planter that Hudson was then using on his farm. Among the details visible is what at left looks like to be a bag of American A extra heavy seed corn. And of course, I have no idea whether that particular brand of corn is still in production in any way or fashion. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information. We don't have a lot of information about Pearlie and his photography. Available facts would suggest that he took a lot of images of rural life in northern Butler County, both on his own farm and on his neighbors' farms as well. But as we will explain, circumstances resulted in Pearlie leaving Butler County in about 1910 and moved to Kansas to continue farming there. Much of the story about his photography work went with him to Kansas, where again he died in 1959. Other family members of his generation who might have been able to tell us more about the Hudson photography business have also long since passed away. All that is left now of Pearlie's work are a number of original vintage photographs that Alan was able to retrieve from various family members. They don't tell us the whole story of his photo work. However, they do provide us with some idea as to the typical farming practices and the hardships and the everyday life that were experienced by farm families in Butler County at the start of the 20th century. I will make a note to the audience at this point that as we go through the program here, if Alan and I would perchance make a mistake regarding the type of farm activity that we depict, don't feel free to correct us, by speaking up. Or if any of you longtime farmers out there have any idea or information on the type of farm equipment shown, again, please speak up. We kind of want to make this an informal conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Alan to explain his family's connections to this area and what he knows about his great uncle, A.P. Hudson.
Thank you. A couple of things I would like to mention before we get started on this. First of all, I read a comment that said George Washington could travel no faster than Caesar. That is a period of around 1,800 years. The photographs you're going to see tonight were taken around 1900. 70 years later, approximately, Americans were tromping on the moon. A lot has changed since these photographs have been taken. And so we start out now. Our family basically came to Butler County in 1871. The family came by covered wagon. They camped on the hills just south of Octavia. The Vanderkook family came and met with them and explained to them that there was some land just west of Octavia, turned out to be about 3 miles west of Octavia, that a person had been homesteading but decided not to continue the 5 years necessary to prove up and get the land. So these pieces of property were returned to the federal government, and somebody else then could take over and do the proving up of the homestead. So in 1866, beginning to get information about the land that was available in this area. It had the reputation of being very good land. And so this caused my great-grandfather to go on this expedition coming to this area to see what land might be available. You can see the other things that have happened in our family. The family, there were several members that came, and I think it was the Sandpit Bar and Grill in Bellwood. The brick building was also built by a member of the family, and they owned other property in the area. But the family decided basically their roots were in Missouri. They loved it there. And so they basically returned to that area. At the present time, I'm the only remaining survivor of the family that came in 1871. And so for about 150 years, the land that my great-grandfather finished homesteading has been in the family for that period of time. Next slide.
Okay.
Now, our origin was in Missouri. They came from Indiana, my great-grandparents, to a little town in Missouri, Everton, Missouri, and camped there, and finally decided to establish a homestead there. And there are all kinds of interesting stories about this. The unfinished cabin where a mountain lion came, and they could tell it was sniffing around because they just had curtain walls for part of the building. And my great-grandmother was sitting there with a shotgun just in case the kitty cat had other plans for supper. This is another example of what life was like at that particular time in Missouri. Not high technology.
They must have had a hard time running those bikes up and down those early Missouri roads.
I think that bicycle could really qualify as a suicide machine. And this is, again, some members of the family. The lady sitting in the vehicle closest to our side of the screen was my great-grandmother. And she was, with her husband, the one that finished the homestead north of town here.
We think that's an early Oldsmobile product.
It's also interesting that there was an article that my grandfather drove the first car into the little town of Everton, Missouri. So they were somewhat adventuresome people. I think adventuring to such places in Butler County as Linwood, Surprise, is an adventure in itself. And to pack up and head out to someplace like Nebraska, I'm not sure I have that kind of courage.
Mm-hmm.
Now they arrived in Nebraska. I should make one other comment too. This was 1871. The world was quite different at that time. I remember taking my grandmother to the laundromat in this little town of Everton, Missouri. And she was sitting there watching the machine do all of the work. And without any indication, she turned to me and said, "The good old days were not what they were cracked up to be, and she, for one, wanted no part of them." This is a map of the Bone Creek Township where the farm was located. You go north of David City on Highway 15. You go to the 5 Mile corner. Remember, the highway goes down the middle of the section. So if you turn east, you'll go a half a mile, and there's the crossroad. And there would be the location of where our farm was homesteaded.
Let's see. That was
It would be, get myself over here.
29. It's in 20 and 29. 20 and 29.
Okay, 20.
Yeah, right,
and
pretty
20.
close to the bottom there, yep.
You can see the 160 was at the southwest corner of the section.
Yep.
And over on the left-hand side, you can see a close-up of that particular area. So that's where we have been for quite a period of time.
Yeah, your great, let's see, your two uncles were on either end of that section, weren't they?
Yes, my grandfather had the east half of that 160 acres, and my uncle Pearlie had the west half, that would be 80 acres each of it. And then there was 60 acres that was south of the road, directly south of the home place. The place where my grandparents lived was at the southwest corner of the farm. We also lived on that land, and starting in 1939 until 1946, and we lived on the west 80, about halfway up the 80 acres. We became David City residents in 1946, but continued to, I still have association with the land until just about 3 years ago. This is a picture of the farmhouse where my grandparents and great-grandparents lived. You'll notice the land out in front of this fence. That is Highway 15. It's not quite the turnpike that we think of today. Some things you might notice in the picture, definitely had to have the windmill to supply water. And my mother commented about the house. It was certainly not a Southern plantation edifice. She said it was one of the coldest places she had ever been in the wintertime, that water that you would bring in for washing hands and even drinking overnight in these wonderful Nebraska winters would freeze solid. And so you would have to thaw out the water to even get a drink out of it. Fortunately, you could still pump the water out from the well, and that would be drinkable, but you notice that it is slightly primitive. The only thing I can say to this is burr. This is what this is what winter would be like on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And
the interesting thing to point out is that the farmhouse here was later replaced by the former Marietta Rectory, which would be about a mile to the west.
so times have changed a little bit from the time you see this picture. This is the house that I lived in with my parents from 1939 to 1946. And none of this is still in existence. This was posed to show you the crops. This was on the east side of that farmhouse, and it shows you what the crops were, the abundance of the gardens and so forth. And remember, this was somewhere between 1890 and 1910. I suspect it's closer to 1890 than to 1910. But it looks like things were good. Pork chops on the hoof. And certainly livestock was a major of major importance at that particular time. I think you might say that this farming was what would be called diversified farming. Here's another photograph. This looks like my Aunt Nora Hudson. That was Uncle Pearlie's wife. And I think this is another one of those photographs that is partially staged to show people what kind of things they had to work with. But over at the left-hand corner, it looks like that is the entrance to the cave that they had. Kind of a fruit cellar type thing or a produce cellar. Since they didn't have refrigeration, that would be one way of keeping food, especially after canning. You would keep it in the dark and it would be cool. And so it would even retain its color at that time.
Mhm. And some of you would remember Artie Hudson, who was the last one living on the East Farm. And of course, that's him as a toddler there.
And notice over on the right side, you see a grinding wheel for sharpening tools. And also, it looks like sometimes used as a corn sheller, where you could shell corn by hand. And again, another photograph of just what the farm would look like. Typical farming operation with the pieces of equipment. It looks like over there on the left side, a drill for planting wheat or oats. Mm-hmm. Back in those days, they did plant wheat and they would plant oats. And I remember harvesting oats very well. I cannot think of anything else that is so itchy as the dust from oats. It's Milo. Fortunately, I escaped the Milo plague. So.
And there's trees. So many people say they're old trees,
Mm-hmm.
but there's trees here.
Yes, by 1900 there were trees because they'd had 30 some years approximately to plant trees and get things like that growing. Mm-hmm. Something that was very important for providing water for the cattle. And remember, at this time, horsepower meant horses. So you would want to have a good supply of water for the livestock. And so it was important to have a windmill. This windmill looks like, I think, was taken and was being erected at the farmhouse along the highway in the southeast corner of the farm. And the building in the back was the tank house where they would store, when they would milk, they would store the cream and so forth. And they call it a tank house because they could have some running water through it to keep things cool. This, I think, is the tower that's still on the farm, and it was a 50-foot tower. Some of the other towers were not quite that high for the windmill, but this would put it above the tree line level, and so it would rely on the wind and not have the wind slowed down by blowing through the grove.
Mm-hmm. I understand the Dinkelmans from in here in town now have that windmill head.
This is where the place that was on the West 80, and this is the old barn. While we were living there, the barn had deteriorated to the place that it was no longer structurally safe to be around. And my mother described it during a windstorm that the building weaved to the right, back to the left, and then conceded defeat. What was very interesting, when my dad was salvaging the wood out of the building, that we found a piece of pipe that had been converted into a whistle. Somewhere around our house, and this was going to be an exploration of interesting consequence, that whistle still exists. Now, what it was used for, I have absolutely no idea. It might have been a replacement for a dinner bell. because it does make a rather shrill penetrating sound when you blow on it. This is a small building. They're showing how something like this could be moved. I like the idea of the team of horses being able to pull it, but I also observe that the building is not particularly large, so it would be easy to have the team pull it. One of the legends that exists in the family is that my great uncle remembered the courthouse being taken from Savannah to David City. It was basically grassland, and it was pulled by oxen across the grass. Now, I have not been able to verify that, but that's a story that exists in our family. You have comments to make? You have comments to make on this?
I guess the only thing I need to comment is that, of course, this next section here is pictures of the actual farm work done on the Hudson farms. And again, it is a very nice fact that that Pearlie took the time to actually take pictures of them actually doing the field work, because again, you'd think that given the technology at the time, that again, that would pretty much maybe pretty busy otherwise just doing the work. But again, Pearlie felt it important enough to actually take the pictures that you'll see here. And again, it's to our benefit in current times here. This, like I said, this first photo here, of course, was the description that was on the back of the photo. And again, it's just that I think by the early 1900s, there was there was an agricultural census that counted some 20 million horses and mules on the nation's farms, an average of almost 4 per farm. So this definitely was the age of animal power on the farms before the introduction of tractors.
It's interesting to note that horses, how important they were in the farming process, and all of the different harnesses, netting over the horses to keep flies away from them. It's a world that basically we do not know anymore. It has changed significantly. It took me, this is of course a steam engine and a thrashing machine. It took me forever to figure out the word combine. Where did that word come from? It dawned on me, we would use a binder to bind the wheat, and then we would use the thrashing machine to separate it from the chaff. It was a combination of a binder and a thrashing machine. So we just got the name combine. But it was no small activity when it was time to do the thrashing. There would be crews that were organized of neighbors. They would go from one farm to another. There would be people who would be out picking up the shocks of wheat, putting them on a wagon, carrying them over to where the thrashing machine was. And this is, sometimes these thrashing machines were called a separator, and to separate the grain from the chaff and everything else. You can also see that there was a little bit of a hazard here. The smoke could carry sparks. And it is possible that wheat field stubble could be set on fire. But my uncle ran a steam engine, and he loved them because there was something about all that machinery working that was very exciting. But it would be typical then that there would be large numbers of people working together. They would go from place to place. And of course, the farm family that was hosting the thrashers were expected to provide a very good meal at noontime. And so just preparing the meal for these many people was quite Well, it was quite an activity and quite a challenge because you would be probably 15, 20 people perhaps that you were preparing food for. Poor cows, they get hungry in the wintertime. And pasture land is certainly not available to them when the snows are on. So putting up hay was another significant activity. And in this picture, you can notice right down at the bottom edge of the picture, it looks like there might be some of the materials that my great uncle used for taking the photographs, because these photographs were made on glass plates, not the film that we knew in much later times. And you can, another picture of just what life would be on the farm. Notice that the size of the storage areas much smaller than what we have on farms now with these big bins. I don't even know what the capacity of some of them are. Maybe some of you can tell me, was it 20,000 bushel, these metal bins? Or more, yes. It boggles the mind. Now, this picture, I have no idea what this machine is. It looks like a horse-drawn corn picker, but I wasn't aware of horse-drawn machinery like that. Mm-hmm. So I will leave this to your imagination as to what this really is. But you can see that they were busy posing for this picture.
My observation is that the guy holding up the corn cob there, he's probably just happy that he doesn't have to pick it by hand anymore.
Now, excuse me, this shows once the corn was picked, then you had to put it into, well, storage somehow. Some people had corn cribs built into some of their buildings, and then some people put it out on the ground, just putting a kind of a lath webbing material around it and store it so it would finish drying. Yes. Now you notice that the wagon itself is being elevated. And generally the thing would be a horsepower where there would be 1, 2, or so many horses. We would continually walk in a circle, and they would have a long pole that would be attached to this centerpiece, which would convert their motion into shaft rotation. And this is where they would get the energy and power to raise wagons like this, and also to run the elevator. Another example is you can see the horsepower thing with a single horse doing the work of making sure that the wagon is elevated and the elevator is working. Elevators could be interesting because they could sometimes get tangled up with the big chains, and then you would have one of those snap, and then that meant repairs and delay in getting the crop elevated and into storage. So there were some challenges with that. This is another example of hand work. It wasn't easy. This was done just scooping it by hand. Another example of this, and you notice the wagon, that on the far side of the wagon, it's much taller. The woodwork goes up much taller than on this side. In our family, that was referred to as a bang board, but the idea was that as you hand-picked each ear of corn, you would toss it into the wagon. But sometimes you would be a little bit too energetic, and if you didn't have something like this to intercept the corn ear, it would go on past the wagon and into the next row of corn, which meant you had to go pick it up, and this was another delay you could do without.
How much did they get for roof at the elevator?
I don't know what the prices were at that time, but it was certainly not expensive, that's for sure, for the grain. And here's just another example of the wagon of corn. And I don't remember corn being picked with the husks on it so often. My dad was able to pick the corn and didn't have the husks. It just rarely is still sticking to the ear. But apparently here, that happened quite regularly. Of course, in later years, if you were hand picking, you had a special hook that you could attach to your hand and arm, and that would help you pull out the ear loose from the corn stalk itself. Not only did the livestock have to eat, so did the people inhabiting the farm. And this is an example of the bounty of potatoes being grown. And there was a special plow, or at least a one bottom plow that you could pull through the potato patch. The trick was to get it deep enough so that it was rooting the potatoes and not slicing them. Potato chips came much later. So this was an example of the bounty of the land. And you would probably put this down in one of the cellars. You would have bins for the potatoes, and you would place that. For example, the place where we lived, there was a basement under the front kitchen part of the house where you could take your canned fruit and apples and things like that, and potatoes for storage, and they would last for most of the winter for you.
Mhm. There's a lot of detail. If you blow these pictures up, there's a lot of detail you can see in these pictures. And one thing we noticed was that all the fence posts have cans on the top of them. And so we figured, of course, that the reason for that is that is the one way to keep the for the top of the fence posts from rotting out when it gets moisture on it for so long. So. And more spuds.
I think we'll rush on. This is starting to make me hungry. French fries. How did people live before French fries? This looks like some lumber that is being transported. And again, everything was done with horses, and the wagons are relatively small. So these were not big farming operations. And it would be easy for people to live very well off of even 80 acres of land. 160 was very good. Our world has changed a little bit now, and I don't know what farms are. They range, or the land that is being farmed by a particular operator, 3,000-4,000 acres, and the world has changed a little bit from this time.
Look like bundles of shingles.
Yep. Yes, we figured that too, that they must have got a delivery of lumber and shingles from the lumber yard in town.
And comment about that, remember the Highway 15, what a freeway it was? When the family would want to come to David City, and especially if it had been rainy weather, they would make their way to Octavia, board the train, the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, come to David City, do their shopping, take care of business at the courthouse, other things that were necessary to do in town, and then they would catch the train that evening or afternoon and return to Octavia, and then make their way back home, because the farm was only 3 miles from Octavia. But the highway was a little different. It went to the end of the section, turned north 1 mile, and then turned east towards Octavia, and actually entered the town at the north side of the town, not the way it's done presently.
And this next section here was just pictures that Pearlie had taken of, again, family and friends in social settings. So again, that was another facet of farm life that Pearlie documented.
I don't know the background or story of this gathering, but it was something that would take place. I noticed from a thing that my mother wrote about 1918, they didn't have television. They didn't have all of these other distractions, so a lot of visiting was done between farm families. And in her kind of day book, it's not really a true diary, it's just a day book, the things that they did during the day, would mention people from the neighborhood who would stop by for visits, or they would go to visit some of the neighbors. And so you had a lot more contact with people than I think we're doing today. We certainly have transportation. You can do all kinds of things, but I think we have lost that particular factor. I should mention one other thing about my great uncle. He played the violin. Back then they would call it the fiddle, and he would play for dances. My grandfather would play the piano, and he would do what they called seconding, which means he didn't play the melody or anything, he played the appropriate chords. And so my great uncle would play the music, the tune, the melody, and my grandfather would play the piano with the chords. And this would be the music that people would have other neighbors come in, and they would actually dance to these gatherings with this kind of music being presented.
Mm-hmm.
Do the two on the right have guns?
Yep. I was just going to point that out. We figure they're probably, they were doing target practice as part of the afternoon's entertainment.
I can certainly remember a wedding of a neighbor down at the Holman family. It was, the celebration would be all day, and it would be at your home after the wedding. And one of the things they were doing was target practicing. They would set glass bottles up on a fence post and then fire away at it. And sometimes the glass bottle would shatter, and then sometimes it would kind of say, nya, 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 as the bullet went some other direction. Some other things that were done. Fishing. I found another photograph that we have on display up here on the table. Going fishing, and this is the Platte River. Now, I'm guessing that this was not at flood stage because it looks like my great uncle had waded out into the river, maybe to a sandbar, and then took this particular photograph. Mm-hmm. And of course, it looks like in the background that there was certainly a lunch that was taken along, because fishing, to really do it well, takes a lot of time. And you didn't want to starve in the meantime, because sometimes the fish weren't cooperating. And what would you use for food? So you brought some from home.
Yep. It also appears that they took the seats off of the wagon and were using them as seats for the picnic and fishing.
Again, a world that is quite alien to us at the present time. This was the mail service. The mail carrier, of course, was horse-drawn. And as I remember, at the farm, the mail for the farm came from Bellwood. Fast forward the number of years to about 1941. I got to the 41, 42, and 43. I became interested in being able to read the comics. The mail from our newspaper came from Bellwood. It would arrive at our place sometime between 8 o'clock and 8:30. When we moved to town, I had this weird idea that in town we would even get the mail earlier. 11 o'clock. 3 o'clock. 4 o'clock. Another thing that because we lived on the west part of the farm, and my grandparents lived down the southeast corner of the farm, my mother could put a letter or a postcard in the mail to my grandparents. The carrier would pick it up at our place, drive south to where Highway 15 is and the half-mile east, and deliver it to my grandparents. Now we've improved it where we grab the mail up, we take it to Omaha. I think part of the postage is a storage fee. And then it would be, well, it would make its way eventually back to David City. But back in those days, the rules weren't quite as, well, I guess, so strong and limiting what you could do. It's just the times and the world has changed.
Mm-hmm. I think this is an awesome photo for the fact that it is probably the only known photograph of an actual RFD delivery in Butler County. And of course, not the best quality photo, but you can tell that mail conveyance isn't exactly heated, given the coat, the fur coat that the rural carrier is wearing.
Again, reminds a person of, as a senior citizen, how well I love winter. This is just another example of, it would be my grandmother, my mother, and her sister, Blanche. This was just an example because my mother was born in 1906, and this type of conveyance was still very much in use. I also remember that conveyance, something similar to this. I heard the story that my grandparents would harness up the buggy and they would drive to attend church at the Methodist church. And I spent some time trying to figure out, because I never heard of them going to Bellwood. Finally figured out that they were actually going to the Savannah church. And this would be the transportations they would, something like this would be the thing they would use to go to church on Sunday morning. I haven't figured out the mileage, but apparently the Savannah church was a little bit closer than going to Bellwood. This is my uncle Pearlie and Aunt Nora's only daughter. And again, showing the type of conveyance that they would have at that particular time. It's also interesting to note the dress and to think this was pre-wash and wear. Can you imagine what it'd be like to try to, first of all, launder something like this, and then you would have to press it. And I still have some, what I think they call them sad irons, where you would heat the iron on the cook stove. And the trick was to get it warm enough, but not too warm, because you didn't want to scorch the clothing. So it was kind of a remarkable tight wire act to iron the clothes without causing damage to them. This is another example, again, of two things: the transportation and also the dress.
This obviously was a very special occasion, given how Aunt Nora has got looks like her Sunday best on, and she's carrying some kind of floral arrangement, and the buggy looks like it's really been cleaned up. So it must have been a wedding, perhaps, or some very special occasion.
These were friends of my grandparents, and notice again the nice buggy, but also the netting on the horse to keep the flies away, because I think more than one runaway situation for the teams being spooked would be the flies becoming almost unbearable, and they would just take off running to try to flee from the torment of the flies.
Do you think the women crocheted those, or were they more of something like twine?
I don't have an answer for that. That's an interesting point, because it would be fun to find out if somebody has any knowledge about something like that.
I bet that's not the one they used out in the field.
One does have that suspicion, all right.
Our next section here, again, is scenery and travel. Again, Pearlie took his camera with him when he did some traveling around the state and elsewhere. And also, of course, as you'll see, he's to be admired for just taking very artistic farm scenes like this one here, just at his place during the winter.
It was interesting that the barn that's still standing where my grandparents lived was a picture of it was taken in, I think, 1992, and it appeared in the Nebraska land calendar for that year. And it was a scene something like this with the frost on the trees. It looks beautiful, but I would prefer to be inside where the heat was. Again.
And again, a very awesome depiction here of frost and snow.
Certainly, winters could be, going back to this, it could be difficult at times. Going back to this day book or this record that my mother kept, she was talking about, this was in January, it was time to go back to school because Christmas vacation would not be but about 2 or 3 days at most, that it was 18 below. So we've had some bad since then, but I think this last winter we had something about that kind of temperature, but it's not new, this part of the world. I've started this rumor that the North Pole was moving to Butler County. Unlike last year, it did rain occasionally back in those days, and sometimes almost to excess. And this is a picture of the grove, and this is the one on the west part of this farm, showing the water that had accumulated. This is another photograph of the fields, how could get fairly well flooded. It wasn't really flowing water or rushing water like that, but it was just water that would stand on the surface and slowly drain away. And I don't know that it caused any particular problems as far as the crops were concerned. I don't remember any discussion of that. But this is the way the land might look when the rains came. Again, my great uncle taking photographs. This is a picture of the Nebraska State Capitol building in Lincoln that he took well before the present structure was built. Mm-hmm. And he has taken other pictures around Lincoln, and it's very interesting to try to locate where the photograph was taken, because so many of the points of reference are no longer there. Mm-hmm.
This is the state capitol building that preceded our current state capitol. This building was finished in 1888. Of course, it suffered from poor construction and was settling when talk began of a third state capitol. This building, of course, was raised after the current capitol building was completed between 1922 and 1932. And this picture was taken from the from the O Street overpass in Lincoln. This, of course, shows the Burlington passenger train yards in Lincoln. And the building at left there in the distance is what was the old Burlington station building. And it was replaced in 1927 by the current station building that is still there. However, of course, this scene has otherwise just everything here is almost everything here. This has changed. This building that on the right here is still there, but otherwise all the tracks are gone, and for the most part anyway, and have been replaced by apartment buildings and bars and of course the event center.
This is taken in Arkansas, and my grandparents were headed to Galveston, Texas. And the train, unfortunately, had a close encounter of the third kind with some sheep that had escaped from their enclosure. As you can see, the front pilot wheels of the engine are not on the rails anymore. This is not a good scene for both the train and the sheep. This is an example of their finally reaching Galveston, just showing how the ships and the rigging and so forth existed at that time. And again, our world has changed significantly from that.
14 years.
Yes.
And our final section here has to do with the fact that the Hudson families again moved to Kansas circa 1910. And Pearlie did continue his photography for at least a while down there in around Peabody, Kansas, is where they relocated. I think they figured that there was more farm opportunities down there for them, I take it.
This was my great aunt and uncle's place at Peabody, Kansas, showing a typical farmhouse. This was their front porch, which of course you didn't use because anybody entering the farmyard would come to the back door because there would be a place to park your vehicle. Lots of space there. The front yard was basically ornamental, I would think. It was necessary, of course, to put up hay. And I was interested in the shape of the stacks. I'm not really sure how they were put together, how the hay was manipulated into that kind of position. This is another example of the corn being elevated into storage.
And of course, it's interesting for the fact that a small gas engine is now being used to run the machinery rather than a horse. So again, this shows that by this time the Hudsons were making the transition over to automation insofar as farming was concerned.
This is just about a quarter of a mile from my uncle's place, great uncle's place at Peabody, Kansas. This was very exciting. This was the Rock Island Line. And the thing that was exciting about this train was traveling at 60 miles an hour. That means in 1 minute, it would travel 1 mile. Such speed was so impressive at that time. And sometimes when we're on the freeway in San Francisco, a mile a minute still sounds impressive.
And I can comment on this section here. As we conclude this program, we are left with the speculation that perhaps somewhere there are other farm photos taken by Pearlie Hudson that still survive. Perhaps such images are part of old family photo collections now held by the descendants of farm neighbors and friends of the Hudsons. I include myself among them for this reason. This is a photo taken on our family farm, which of course was about a quarter-mile west of the Hudson farms. And we believe this picture was taken by Pearlie. And my grandfather is front and center there with his hands on his hips. And of course, appears that they're elevating feed into the lean-to of the barn there in order to get the feed to fall into the stall slats that I remember being in that side of the barn. So this is at least one of two pictures that I know of that were taken on our farm that I believe Pearlie was responsible for taking pictures of. And with that, we will conclude with some acknowledgments. Of course, I didn't get it on here, but of course, first and foremost, thanks to the Hruska Library here for helping us with host this program. And again, and certainly again, thank you, Jackie, for your Kolachi contribution. And otherwise, of course, thank you to Anna and Alan for your participation in this program. And thank you to Jim Hanna of Columbus for helping put together the actual PowerPoint that you just saw. And thank you to the Butler County Historical Society for being interested enough to help sponsor this program. And of course, Bone Creek Museum of Agrarian Art, which Anna and Alan are involved with. Again, they were helpful in regards to the artistic part of this endeavor. And then, of course, thank you to Gene Hine and Kevin Meisenberg of the Boston Studio Project for doing the photo scanning of the photographs that you just watched. And these photographs are otherwise now part of the Boston Studio Project website. So if you go on to the butlercountygallery.com and go, I believe, to the Hudson Covault collection, you can see these photographs otherwise. And otherwise, I do have an acknowledgement on here to a book called Pioneer Life on Glass, with a copy of which I have here. It provided some of the statistics we were quoting in this program here, but otherwise it is a book about another photographer up in the Cairo area of Nebraska who was very similarly photographed farm life in that part of the state. And otherwise, I think the only other thing was that I need to give a shout out to the Butler County Historical Society for the fact that this, of course, was just an informal history program, but we've of course already had two actual of our regularly scheduled history programs for the year already, but we have another one coming up on September 9th here, and it has to do with schoolhouses and rural education in Butler County. And Carm Fiala will be giving the presentation on that one. So with that, I think we will.
I'll just make a comment.
Pardon?
I'll make a comment about these.
Okay. Alan,
In conclusion here, I have brought some photographs that were not included in the show tonight. One of them is a picture of the Schuyler Bridge in 1904. And on the back side of the photograph, it says, washed out in 1905. Also, my uncle built a camera that would take the stereopticon photographs, the 3D ones. There are a number of them that he took, have on display up here, and we invite you to come and take a look at some of those, because there are pictures such as the old school in Octavia, the bank in Octavia, and other things, including the digging of the ditch that's there at Highway 15 and 64 intersection north of town. So I think you will find some of those interesting as well.
all right. Well, I guess I have nothing else to add other than, again, please take a look at the photographs. And if no one has any questions that didn't come up otherwise, we'll consider this good. And we all thank you for coming. Sheriff. Cheryl.
I was showing you, when you showed the flat map of your family settled on the Bone Creek, and how you showed your family farm was on Bone Creek. Is that where Bone Creek got its name, because your family settled there?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, the question was the fact that the Hudson farms were located near Bone Creek, and of course, whether that was the inspiration for a Bone Creek Museum of Agrarian Art. So
Another little, go ahead, Hannah.
We were trying to find a name that when you went to Google it, you would find it, and someone said, what about Oxbow? And I typed in my computer, this was in 2007, and there were hundreds of hits for
give her the
Oxbow.
mic.
I said, Alan, what's the name of that creek that runs through your farm? He said, Bone Creek. I typed it in. It said, runs through Butler County, Nebraska. And there are a lot more since then, and there's some other, but at that time, that's why they went with it. Very smart. So Google tries to sell us to get upgrade that, and I tell them, can you go to your computer and type in Bone Creek and see what happens? And that's the end of the conversation.
Okay. If nothing else, I guess we will consider this good. And we thank you all for coming, and safe trip home.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.